and welcome to Behind the Dean's Desk, conversations from the College of Graduate and Professional Studies at the Chicago School. I'm Dr. Alisha DeWalt, Dean of the College of Graduate and Professional Studies. This series is designed to highlight our community voices, ideas, and professional impact that shape our graduate and professional programs. In each episode, we step away from formal titles and curricula to have a real conversation about the work we do, why it matters, and how it connects to practice in the field. All right, well, welcome everyone. Today I'm joined by Dr. Tyler Ray, a faculty member in the Behavioral Analysis Division. Tyler's research alongside his students really explores how leadership practices shape teams, organizations, and ultimately the quality of care delivered in real-world settings. So Tyler, thank you for being here today, and thanks for joining me behind the Dean's Desk.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very honored to be able to share a lot of the work that actually my students are working on, and super excited to kind of highlight the things that we're learning.
Wonderful. Well, Tyler, I thought we could start with level setting on what applied behavioral analysis is. It's one of our largest divisions at the Chicago School. And I think when people think about behavioral analysis, many go directly to working with individuals with autism, working in that therapy setting. I know I did in my undergrad career, work in that space as well. Could you frame what behavioral analysis is and how we apply it to other applications?
Yeah, of course. So this is actually one of my favorite topics because behavior analysis, as you mentioned, we're known as the autism treatment field, right?
Yeah.
But what people don't actually realize is how much behavior analytic research have applied to a variety of things. So, for instance, one study from, I want to say the late 80s, early 90s is Scott Geller. And what he ultimately did was he was called into a local mall. And it was back in the days where everybody was smoking. And so the fire department was getting called to malls all the time, right? Because people were putting their cigarette butts in the trash, their trash in the ashtrays, and there were just fires, rampant fires, right? So the whole aim of what he ended up doing was a great synopsis of what our field is. And what it is looking at those environmental variables, adjusting those environmental variables to seek or evoke a different type of behavior. So what his study did was he adjusted where the ashtray was compared to a trash can. He had them right next to each other. He had them across the median or the little pavilions within the malls. He adjusted it so that the ashtray was on top of the trash can, had a bunch of different variations, and ultimately found that the main issue was that people were using the receptacles for the wrong use, right? So trash was going in the ashtray, cigarette butts were going in the trash can, and the simple manipulation of putting the ashtray on top of the trash can led to a significant reduction in fires in the mall. And so I know that that's a really outside there study that was done, but I think it's a really great picture of how it can be applied to a much wider issue. There's been other studies on increasing seatbelt usage. I think it was John Austin back in 96, if I recall correctly. There's been community health studies. There's health, sport, and fitness. There's policy change. So Derek Reed did a study on tanning and self-tanning in the tanning beds, and used behavioral economics to evaluate what percent of attacks would impact the occurrence or usage of tanning beds within college towns. And we all know that tanning beds typically are going to lead to some or increase the likelihood of skin cancer, right? And so his whole thing was how do we address this issue? And so it was merely what level tax would have to be implemented to reduce the use of tanning beds, which then would ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, reduce the occurrence of skin cancer in the larger population. So there's just such a wide breadth of research that we're doing that's really exciting. I'm going to cite just one last study
Yeah.
and highlight a study that Dr. Amanda Mahoney, one of my colleagues in the Behavior Analysis Division, she and Alan Poling ended up doing a study in, I can't remember which African country, but they ended up training Nutria to sniff out bombs so that they could go and clear a field so that it was safe for local communities to walk through these fields for obviously safety. So the application of behavior science and behavior analysis is pretty far fetched,
Yeah.
despite that our field is just known for the autism treatment.
That's so fascinating. Thank you for citing those studies. I wouldn't,
Yeah.
I think about the organizational piece, which we'll talk about soon, but truly the breadth of where behavioral sciences can be applied is fascinating. And from a career outcomes perspective, right? And getting that master's degree, there's so many different places and spaces you can be. So thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, Tyler, I'd love for you to talk about what you do specifically in this field. Can you share like what your focus is from a research perspective?
Yeah, so over the years, I feel like the background is kind of important, but over the years, I
Absolutely.
started in like as a behavior technician, but back then there wasn't that title. So I started working with kids with autism, and then I ended up becoming board certified, and then started supervising others, and then worked into a clinical director role and leadership roles. And the one thing that I kept coming back to is even though our field's focus has always been on autism, what our time spent on is staff development, right? And so, as a supervising BCBA in a clinical setting, I may be writing a plan for somebody to implement for the client, right? But a majority of my time is checking to ensure that that staff member is following the plan. So there's treatment integrity, which then leads into performance management. Performance management is a subdomain of what's called organizational behavior management. And so that is one of the areas that I feel like is a really direct path for many BCBAs to dip their toes into OBM. And so when I started seeing this kind of shift, my research really focused more on staff development. So like my dissertation was training teachers to train paraprofessionals to implement a classroom management system, right? And so what I was able to look at was looking at, first off, am I training the teacher effectively to both implement the skill, but also implement the training practices? Did those teachers then implement the training practices with their staff? And then as a team, were they able to implement that classroom management system within the classroom? And then how did that impact the student, right? So my research has kind of always focused on multi-tiered systems of how do we intervene at the supervisor or leadership level, move to the employee or staff member level, and then how does that impact any service delivery or organizational outcomes. And so that's really where a lot of my research has been going, especially with the mentorship that I'm providing with my students. So like, for instance, I have one student, Valeria Pascale, who is actually in Naples or Salerno, Italy. And she is getting ready to propose her dissertation in 2 weeks. And what we're looking at is exactly what I just described. How do we train leaders to implement task clarification, performance feedback within a human services setting, at a governmental agency, by the way? And then how does that impact the staff member? How does that impact the client the service recipient, but then how does that impact organizational outcomes of staff retention, of performance feedback situations, and a variety of variables that she'll be taking a look at. So it's
Wow.
just been really fun to see like how to impact different levels of an organization with one simple intervention at one point in the organization.
That's fantastic. It makes me think about, Tyler, like what, from like a behavioral science perspective, what have you found in your research or students found their research about what makes an effective leader? I'm always curious about the leadership
Okay.
side to all these, right? It's all intertwined. So what have you seen from the behavioral science perspective and what makes that
Yeah.
effective leader?
So now you're really getting into my bread and butter.
Okay.
Um, as I mentioned, my experience has been like working in leadership roles, trying to figure out how to support leaders in a more effective manner. Um, and I came across the research of Dr. John Austin. He's very well known. He's the one who developed the performance diagnostic checklist, which is essentially the functional behavior assessment for organizational or OBM strategies. Okay. There's
Okay.
been a variety of variations since 2000 on that. And recently in 2023, I just so happen to have the book, so I'll give his little thing. Results
Nice.
is a wonderful book that his last chapter actually talks about what he calls it behavior science for leaders. And he has classified 3 different categories of behavior that any leader needs to be able to master. The first is self-management, the second is relationship management, and the third is performance management. So what my research lab is working on is trying to figure out different behaviors that we can pinpoint at each of those 3 different categories. So for instance, one of my former students, Shefali Manocha, she ended up doing a study on time management, and we found an article that was, in order to effectively engage in time management, it's like the magic number of 3s, but you have to be able to schedule your time, adapt your time, or protect your time. Okay.
Okay.
So what she ended up doing.
Self-reflecting here.
I regularly do as well. But what she ended up doing was first off just providing task clarification, a little bit of training to some leaders on how to structure their time, right? We hypothesized that the activities or tasks within a work environment that were less desirable would be the ones that would be more adapted, meaning like when that task came up, something else comes up and they're like, this is more important. Let's jump to that because I don't want to do this task. But what we ultimately found out was that actually didn't have a correlation because the tasks that were undesired were like mandatory tasks, and the tasks that were more desired that would have been more protected were like the more discretionary tasks within an organization. And so it was really interesting to see how that hypothesis actually was false. And so that was really interesting. I have another student that's worked on relationship management, how to build rapport with a direct supervisee. And then I have other students, and it's more the performance management side. I feel like that's probably the area that our field has the most research on.
Yeah.
But Dr. Sarah Lalani developed 9 steps of pinpointing, like how to effectively pinpoint. And so she was one of my students and actually the co-director of my research lab. And then I have other students that are using task clarification, looking at different schedules of reinforcement and things along those lines. So as a leader, like being able to master each of those 3 skill sets, if you will, is much more complex than just saying, I can manage my time. Well, what does time management look like, right? And then relationship management. How do you actually build that rapport so that those difficult discussions can be bi-directional? So that, yeah.
I'm so curious on that one, Tyler, because you think about relationship management to me wouldn't have necessarily been like top of my list from a behavioral science perspective, right? I expect that in different fields where we're putting that forward and having those conversations. Can you say more about that? I'm just curious from that lens, how are you, I don't know, developing that skill set for relationship management? Like what criteria are you looking at? How are we training leaders to increase their relationships? Does
Yeah,
that make sense?
so yeah, it does. So we're actually leaning very heavily on the uh, clinical psychology side of things. It's called motivational interviewing.
Yep. Okay.
Um, Rosengren 2018, I believe, has a really great workbook that goes through all of the different types of uh, motivational interviewing contexts. I am not an expert in that area, so I can't really talk at depth about it. However, what we're doing is trying to focus on like open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and I forgot what S is, but for OARS, OARS.
Okay.
And we are looking at teaching people to engage in those specific skills. Um,
Okay.
like the open-ended questions doesn't necessarily always have to be like, where are you going to be in 5 years within your career, right? Like it can be, hey, what are you doing with your family later? And it may be a way just to kind of create that connection that's beyond just supervisor employee relationships.
Right.
And I can't say empirically that that will definitively make any impact on rapport building skills at this time. But if you look at anecdotal and everyday interactions, the people that I am most comfortable with, I'll share a little bit more about like family life or things that I'm working that I'm not really
Yeah.
like announcing yet. And that kind of opens up the door to have some of those more difficult conversations that aren't going to be taken as like
Absolutely.
a personal attack. And so that's kind of what my former student, Dr. Rebecca Gonzalez, worked on was how do we build in some open-ended conversations during supervision times
Hmm.
to impact that relationship. And we measured that using the leadership exchange, LMX, Leader Member Exchange 7, which was originally published in 1995. I can't remember the first author's name. But it's 7 questions of what is your perception of the supervisor employee relationship, and then what is the employee's perception of the supervisor employee relationship, and then they come back and discuss how that interacts. And so it's just a really interesting way because, as you mentioned, like that's kind of a little bit outside of a
Yeah.
behavior analytic realm, right?
Yeah.
So we're targeting those specific behaviors that we can observe, but we're also using some level of self-report and perception to then back up that, okay, we saw an increase in the open-ended questions asked during supervision meetings. Did that impact this perception over here on the LMX setting? And so that's kind of how we're juggling the two of having
Hmm.
some self-report, but also having the objective behavioral data.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. That's so
Yeah.
interesting. And it's I always enjoy hearing that research backed leadership development, right? And really being able to
Mhm.
point to those behaviors. Um, it's just fascinating. So thank you.
Yeah.
I do
Of
have
course.
one more question related to your research and the work.
Yeah.
Just curious on from your experience in organizations, what are like those most common mistakes that organizations are making when it comes to trying to improve performance of a group or a leader or trying to have more accountability within the team? What are those like common issues
Yeah.
that you've seen?
That's a really great question. And unfortunately, I don't really have a direct answer because I think there's so many variables across organizations. But I can give some examples of what I have seen.
Yeah.
So I used to work at, I'll just leave it vague, but I used to work
Yeah.
somewhere
Hmm.
and there was high turnover rates, right? Our field is known for high turnover rates because it is a very demanding job, especially at the behavior technician level of working one-on-one with clients, or sometimes working through those challenging behaviors that may occur, right?
Right.
And the organization's perception was that people were resigning because they weren't getting paid enough. And while that is probably some level of what is impacting somebody to resign, that's not going to be 100% of what that is. So what we ended up doing within that organization is that a fellow BCBA and I decided to do a systems level analysis. And we looked at all of the potential variables. We ended up doing some surveys of like, what are some things that you enjoy about your job? What are some things that really need to improve? How are you working with your supervisor, and those types of variables? And what we came to the realization of is that staff were reporting that they wanted more training on different areas of their job. And so my colleague and I developed a training procedure where we redeveloped our positive behavior interventions and support plan for the entire organization. We implemented a bi-weekly training with every employee, where week one, we kind of went over a content area, and then we did follow up of like, hey, you implemented this for the last 2 weeks. How did it come out? What changes did you see? What changes did you hope to see and didn't see? And had follow-up trainings like that. We also implemented a peer mentoring program. So as staff went through those trainings, they were able to show that they mastered a skill or were fluent with it or whatever, and that became their opportunity to mentor a newer faculty or a newer staff member. And so that was just one component of it. We also then were using data to evaluate the use of restrictive procedures, and we were pinpointing staff that had higher frequency use of these restrictive procedures, and we're providing a little bit of additional training for them. But I say this all to show that, again, an intervention at one point in the organization, we ran it for a year. I'm happy to say years later, it's still in practice. And from when we implemented the procedure to when we did like a year check-in, and we've been doing yearly check-ins since then, they went from 100% turnover rate on an annual basis to an 80% retention rate within 1 year. And there was no impact on pay scale, right? And so it's not always that money is what's leading to a turnover rate. Sometimes it's support. Sometimes it's just more training. Sometimes it's recognition of what's been achieved. There's so many variables that could impact that retention rate that I think is it seems a lot more simplistic, that like, hey, you can just do this one intervention and you're going to impact all these different levels of the organization.
Yeah, but I also hear it's not a knee-jerk reaction, right? It's not from one lens, from one leader who's like, I see the problem, let's just change that. Like, that is a time-intensive, resource-driven plan to put together, but ultimately had such a positive impact on the organization. I think that's just so important, the power of the field that you're in that can make those types of changes, and that there's so much science behind it, right? And there's so much testing and work behind it. So thank you for sharing that.
I think that's a great point, because I do want to just say, like, that our field is so focused on ensuring that we're improving the quality of life of the service recipients that we're supporting, right? But we are still working in a business. And so being able to show that we're having two impacts, we're having an impact on the client or the service recipient and their quality of life, but we're also having an impact on the organization's KPIs, right? They're saving money by having staff stay. Like, the cost of replacing a staff member is one of the highest expense points in most organizations. So
Right.
if you can keep a staff member there longer, you're saving money for the organization. And so now you have two ends of an organization that are seeing better outcomes. And that's
Yeah.
what I love about the research and practice that I'm in.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Tyler, I'd love to hear more about the lab that you've been referring to with your students. Can you
Yeah.
share, like, how do students get into the lab? What else are you working on? Anything you'd like to share in that
Yeah.
space?
Yeah, of course. So my lab is literally just reach out to me. Reach out to myself, reach out to Dr. Sarah Lalani. You can talk to pretty much any faculty member in the behavior analysis department and say you're interested in OBM or leadership, and they'll probably connect you with me. And so just reach out and I'll set it up. My lab is separated into two different groups. I have a projects lab meeting, which is that we are actually engaging actively in developing research, conducting research, and things along those lines. But then I also have a roundtable portion of my lab. And the roundtable is typically anybody that's interested in lab joins us, and it's literally a topic of discussion. So one of my PhD level students may lead the conversation. I've had a master's level student that led the conversation, and it literally is just like, hey, this is something that I've come across in practice. Let's talk it out as a group, so that we're balancing research and practice, because I think and it's been well documented that that's a big gap, right? Of having research practice. There's not always a bridge there. And so that's something that I am trying to address within the lab. But also, my students are amazing. I've already kind of called out some of my former students. I mentioned Valeria. But I also have students that are working on how to train individuals to identify ethical and non-ethical uses of AI within behavior analysis. I have a student that is getting ready to, and I should call out, that's Stephanie Suarez, a PhD student. Joe Rossano is doing impact of lottery systems on staff attendance. Heather Murray's looking at training to develop culturally informed treatment practices. Natalia Lewis is a really exciting study in that she's trying to train state level employees who are making funding decisions how to interpret the data that behavior analysts are sharing, so that they can look at a graph and say, hey, this is working or this isn't working. Where should our funding go, right? So her study is not looking at specifically like the path of the funding, but giving the tools to state level employees to be able to evaluate the impact of the services that are being provided. So those are just a few of my students. We're also exploring psychological safety, and Dr. Lalani and I are working on extending her dissertation and pinpointing. I'm still continuing to look into classroom management systems, because that's kind of where I grew up and got my experience. So looking at classroom management systems and how to improve some of those types of things for both general education and special education teachers. So yeah, we just have a wide variety of projects that we're looking at, that honestly, some are led by Dr. Lalani and I, and then others are student led, and they're coming into us, and so that we have this nice little network to be able to bounce ideas back and forth.
Okay, and now I want to talk to every single one of them because their work
Yes.
sounds so great and moving the field forward. I'm curious from you, Tyler. You've been working with all these students so closely. You're building this community, right? Which is just wonderful. Um, what have the students taught you in
Ooh,
working with them in this way? How have they furthered your professional development or the work that you do with students? What have you
yeah.
learned from them?
That is a really great question.
Mhm.
So my students are constantly pushing me outside of my comfort zone, and that is amazing. So like Stephanie bringing up AI, I'm not an AI person, and so to push me into learning more about the use of AI in clinical practice, how to identify ethical and unethical uses, that's been a wonderful example. Paul McComas is actually doing a novel study that I think is going to have large ramifications in the field, where he just completed data collection, but he's looking at the impact of staffing rotations with clients in a clinic-based setting. So he had it so that there were, I think it was 3 weeks where it was one staff member working with one client for the entire 40 hours a week.
Mm-hmm.
And then he rotated for the following 3 weeks, there were 4 staff members that were rotating and working with that one client. And what he was looking at was trials per day and week, staff burnout, master trials for the client, had a variety of variables. And so I'm not going to lie, it's been a while since I've been looking at those types of components of clinical service. So pushing me to see where there are still issues that haven't been explored within
Yeah.
clinical practice. I won't call out organizations, but he reached out to several organizations like, how do you determine your scheduling practices? And they're like, completely organizational based, right? Like, what are our needs? How do we make sure that we're getting as many clients serviced as possible? And his study, I think, is going to really bring some really new information into the field that's going to be worthwhile in discussion and presentations and publications. But kind of bringing it back of like, my students are constantly pushing me to explore new areas. And I think that is my absolute favorite part of the mentoring that is done within a faculty role and research, is that your students are going to bring ideas to you, and they may not be what you thought of. They may not be something that you have a history with, but to be able to explore that portion of the literature that you may not have been diving into previously is amazing, because it's just kind of bringing this full circle, showing how wide of a breadth our field actually impacts society, our science services. That's probably my absolute favorite thing that my students are pushing me to do.
Thank you for sharing. And thank you for all that you do for these students. It's quite amazing, the work that's being generated and the research from your lab. And I think it's also so cool that our students get to explore the topic of their passion too, right? Because that's not always an option when you're going into grad school. Sometimes you're working on the faculty members' work and doing that research, and you don't get that option to really explore your passion that you're finding in the literature as you're going through your graduate program.
Right. Yeah. It's been fun. So thank you.
Yeah. Good. So Tyler, if let's say we have a prospective student who's listening and kind of exploring the behavioral analysis field, what would you encourage them to be looking at when you're exploring graduate programs or looking at the field for their potential next step? What are some things they should be thinking about?
Yeah, so there are obviously variables across the board, right? So one of the key things that everybody's been trained to look into is pass rates on the BECB exam, but also what faculty are you going to be learning from? What area of the field do you want to specialize in? What modality do you want to learn on? So I've been lucky enough to be teaching in the online or distance learning portion of our behavior analysis program. And so that offers a level of flexibility that allows students to attend class in the evenings. I know that our on-ground counterparts also provide classes in the evening, but it's based on Zoom. So it's not that you're traveling somewhere to go to a class. And I will say that you still create those relationships with your peers as long as you're reaching out and making those connections. But ultimately, the key factor that I would encourage anybody to look into is what are you specifically wanting to expand in? So is it autism service delivery, which is going to be quite a few schools? Is it organizational behavior management, which would be fewer schools? Is it health, sport, and fitness? kind of look at what those programs are aimed at teaching and make a decision on what's best for their own career goals.
Great. Well, thank you, Tyler. And thank you for joining me on this Behind the Dean's Desk episode. I do have one last question for you.
Right.
And it's one that I ask all of everyone I've been talking to. And it's, as we step away from our titles and our roles in these sessions, what's one thing you hope people learn or better understand about behavioral analysis? And why does it matter?
Yeah. Yeah. I think we've been kind of touching upon it throughout the entirety of this interview, right? Of behavior analysis is applied to all aspects of life. There is an argument that behavior analysis should be considered a natural science because of the variables that we can look at and then predict if a specific behavior is going to occur or not occur. But again, I mentioned health, sport, and fitness. So how can we improve somebody's quality of life through improving nutrition, improving exercise routines, improving other areas that, like one of the areas is like sedentary work styles. How do you improve some of those things? How do you improve ergonomics at a desk? So that's like one area, right? And then I kind of already touched upon on like the community involvement and community level support, autism, obviously, organizational behavior management, leadership. One area I haven't really talked about is behavior-based safety, which is a subdomain of OBM, but how do you improve safety behaviors within an organization? But all of these, regardless of what area that we're looking at, is ultimately to improve the quality of life of someone, whether it's the staff member, the client, the leader, the I'll say the organization, in the sense that improve the lifespan of the organization. The aim is to always be improving upon something. So yeah, I think that's the most important component.
I love that. Always be improving. What a great field to be in, right? To be able to do that work.
Become a lifelong learner. That's the important part.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Tyler. It's been such a pleasure learning from you and talking more about this really important topic, and the options that we provide at the Chicago School for Behavioral Analysis. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise.
Thank you. It was an honor.